Hello, everyone, and welcome back to a new season of the podcast Byzantium and Friends. I'm Anthony, your host. Took a long summer and early fall break for various family reasons. I'm very happy to be back doing this again. I've got a very interesting list of guests lined up for this coming fall and winter. Also, I'm happy to report that two new books that I've written, I didn't write them at the same time, but they've sort of come to a head at the same time, are being put in production. The one is called Phantom Byzantium, and it is about the making of the idea of Byzantium in Western thought from late antiquity to World War II. It's a pretty broad survey, not that long. And the second is the new history of the siege and fall of Constantinople in 1453. I'll have more updates on those as I get the proofs out and we have covers and release dates ready. Now, our topic for today is animal sacrifice. And this is one of the most important rituals in ancient Mediterranean religion, going way back into prehistory. And yet it all comes to an end pretty quietly, like with a kind of whimper, in the 4th century AD, let's say. This is the 1st century of the East Roman state. And, of course, this is a period of Christianization, and those two are related, but that might not have been the only reason. So a practice that was of great importance to ancient religion comes to an end. Now, here's what's important for us to actually visualize what this entailed, at least in its classic, most familiar form of a community sacrifice of, let's say, an ox. That could be a smaller domesticated mammal, livestock usually, because it's something that the modern imagination about the ancient world has generally tried to avoid, even though we certainly have very detailed artistic representations of this, especially from the period of the Roman Empire. But it's something that has kind of been written out of, for example, many films about antiquity. If you think about all the sort of Roman sword and sandal classics from the 20th century, they shy away from that. It was really only the series Rome that tried to depict something of like Roman religion. You have to imagine a procession going around a town with musical accompaniment and possibly some sorts of banners with the animal garlanded, and they reach an altar and there are prayers and a fire, and then an axe drops and there's blood, and some people get splattered in blood, and there are flies, and it is as messy as you can imagine. So it's unclear if the sort of wealthy elite sponsor of the event, who provides the animal, is in the thick of all the gore, but if you now try to picture a hecatomb, so in theory you sacrifice 100 of these animals. In fact, there's a massive altar of Zeus at the town of Dion in Greece, sort of at the foothills of Mount Olympus, and it has this very, very wide altar where it was possible to bring the animals up in like rows and sacrifice them. And just try to picture that. I mean, just think of the flies. So this image was not very consistent with what early modern and modern Europeans like to think of when they thought of the ancient world, from which they ostensibly derived so many values and classical traditions. And they just really didn't like to imagine their favorite authors and emperors and generals engaging in this kind of practice. The ancients are supposed to be rational and, espouse civilized values and so on. These are discordant images. Well, they did do this, and they did stop doing it more or less during the 4th century. And it is also a fact that at that time, Christians who were increasing in number in the empire regarded it as a sort of revolting, disgusting practice. It's not entirely clear how all those elements are combined, however, and it's easy to construct a narrative whereby the empire converts to Christianity, Christians dislike animal sacrifice, therefore that goes out of fashion and eventually extinct. Well, it doesn't go entirely extinct. There's still places where it's practiced, one of them being my island, Lesbos, where it continued throughout the whole Middle Ages, just rededicated to saints, but it's recognizably the same practice and not an antiquarian revival. Nevertheless, for the most part, it was a practice that went out of use. But the actual history of animal sacrifice in this transitional period, from the sort of high Roman Empire to late antiquity, is very difficult to reconstruct. Our sources, or at any rate, our data, is not anywhere as good as we would like. And there are other approaches that might be more profitable or insightful when it comes to understanding this transition. And so I jumped at the chance to read the latest book by my guest today. This is James Rives, who is a professor of classics at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And he's someone whose work I have followed and read for decades. He's written one of the best books on religion in Roman Carthage, and also a very important article on the religious policies of the Emperor Decius, or Decius, in the mid-3rd century. This is an emperor who ordered an empire-wide sacrifice. We'll be talking about that in the episode. And it is an extremely important article in the way that it combines imperial policy, imperial infrastructure, and the religious history of the empire at that time. So the most recent book is called Animal Sacrifice in the Roman Empire, Power, Communication, and Cultural Transformation. And it tends to look primarily at the economics of sacrifice and its sociology. Who was paying for these? What was the structure of society in Roman cities that incentivized them to do so? And what was changing in the period from the 3rd to the 4th century that may have contributed to the decline of this very ancient religious practice? And that's the part of the book that we're focusing on. A lot of the book covers the earlier Roman Empire from the beginning, from the reign of Augustus. We're going to be looking more at the discussion and analysis of the later phases, which are most relevant to this podcast and presumably to most of you. Okay, let's get right to it then. Thanks again to medievalist.net for reposting these episodes. Hello, Peter. It's good to be back. And here's my conversation with James Rives. James, thank you for coming on.
Thanks very much for inviting me, Anthony.
I was looking forward to this opportunity because, as I mentioned in my message to you, I heard you speak at Michigan in the 90s. Your book on Carthage was one of the most important books on Roman religion or religion in the Roman Empire for me.
Wow.
And as we will mention later, your article on the Emperor Decius was really fundamental. I think it's one of the most important articles in my field, at least, even though it's not technically Byzantine, but I think it points to later developments in such a important way. So I was very happy that you published this book, and then we can talk about animal sacrifice, because it's one of those topics that most people in my field believe it belongs to antiquity and scholars of ancient religion. But in fact, as you show, it's precisely in, let's say, the 3rd and 4th centuries that animal sacrifice acquires this really kind of unprecedented power in terms of state-subject relations in the Roman Empire. And that's the part of the book I wanted to focus on. But first, let's just talk about animal sacrifice just a little bit in general, because it's one of those topics that has been used by theorists of religion, mostly also historians of religion, as a kind of key by which to unlock not just ancient religion, but kind of like religion in general, the origin of religion. Like it's got some kind of secret is embedded in animal sacrifice. And if we only knew why they were doing this very, very strange thing, we would understand religion in general. And you talk about some of these theories at the end, and I want to draw attention to what you say there. You say, in my view, there's nothing particularly special about animal sacrifice. It does not provide us with unique insights into the human condition or a unique key to understanding the ancient Mediterranean world. So that's a kind of unusual kind of statement for someone to make about their topic. Usually, the topic explains everything. So what brought you to that point? What are you pushing back against in your field?
Well, superficially, I would say it was a certain orneriness. I mean, pushing back against the tendency, as you say, of all of us to sort of aggrandize our particular topic of inquiry. But more specifically, it was a reaction against these sort of monolithic theories that take animal sacrifice and use it as the basis for an explanation of everything. And these were the theories that dominated the field when I was in grad school back in the 80s. I'm thinking in particular of Walter Burkert and
Hmm.
René Girard, who both focused on violence in animal sacrifice and saw that as revealing fundamental aspects of human character, psychology, social formation. And also the French structuralist classicists, Jean-Pierre Vernant and Marcel Detienne, who were more historically inflected, but also saw animal sacrifice as the key to decoding a comprehensive worldview. So it was a pushback against this kind of all-encompassing theory. For me, what's interesting about animal sacrifice is not as a key that explains everything, but as a practice that is tied up in many different ways with other aspects of human culture and human society. And I say human, but I'm thinking, of course, specifically about the ancient Mediterranean world. I don't make any larger claims as to my contribution in terms of what it provides for any sort of understanding of sacrifice in general. I'm looking at a very specific historical context. And
Hmm.
it's this interconnections of animal sacrifice with these other historical contexts of its time that's important to me.
Yeah, because you're coming at it from the standpoint of a historian of religion in a very well documented historical period. And I say well documented in comparison to the periods in which, let's say, Burkert or the structuralist thought that the kind of original moment was operating. I mean, Burkert was even reaching into theories of evolution,
Right. Yeah.
evolutionary psychology, and tapping into like primordial notions of, I think, guilt and violence, right? And the structuralists were in part trying to understand, kind of to build a bridge between ritual and myth.
Mhm.
And this is all like it's pre any text that we have,
Right.
right?
Right.
All of this stuff that kind of then subsequently somehow explains, I don't know, through inertia or whatever, why ancient societies continue to practice this. But you're looking very specifically at historical moments that are documented in texts and inscriptions, and you don't offer an anthropological or theological explanation of sacrifice, but instead you interpret it more sociologically and economically, right? In the context of the cities of the Roman Empire. So, what elements do you focus on specifically in your interpretation? Insofar as sacrifice is a form of communication between someone and someone else, so who's communicating what to whom?
Right. Yeah. I really ground it in its economic context. For me, not the key, but the starting point for interpreting animal sacrifice in Greco-Roman antiquity is the fact that animals are valuable resources. Um, they're resources that a lot of people couldn't afford to consume on any sort of regular basis or to use on any sort of regular basis. And accordingly, when someone slaughtered an animal as a gift to the gods, that was, as much as it was a statement of piety, it was also a statement of wealth, of control over certain economic resources. And it was a statement that did not require, that no one required any sort of interpretive key or doctrine to understand. It would have been inherent. Anyone in the ancient world would have known that when someone sacrificed a full-grown sheep, much less a full-grown ox, that was a display of wealth, that someone had the resources to slaughter that animal. And to me, this is the starting point for my investigation of how it fit into wider society. I don't want to be too reductionist about this, because for people in the ancient world, animal sacrifice was above all an expression of piety towards the gods. It was a way of winning the gods' goodwill. And that, in a sense, goes without saying. There's a lot to be said about that, but that's not what I wanted to focus on in my book. As I say, I really began with the economic aspect. And I think the fact that it is a display of wealth, um, and thereby communicates a sort of superior economic status is fundamental to the way I approach it. But also the fact that when you slaughter an animal, you generate inevitably a fair amount of a highly desirable consumer good, and that is good quality meat, which again is something that most people, most of their lives wouldn't have come across that easily.
Mm-hmm.
So for these two reasons, it could serve as a way, as a tool for structuring socioeconomic hierarchies. Slaughtering an animal, inviting other people to partake of the meat that's generated by that animal is a display of wealth, and it bestows a benefaction on other people. And that's, for me, um, an, an entry point into understanding how it fit into this society.
Right. There is a sort of more vertical communication going on with the gods. And there are a number of texts from the empire that talk about this, but you're more interested in the social, I mean, also vertical, but in a sense more horizontal
Right.
if
Yeah.
you add the gods into the
Yeah.
yeah, that's going on. And it's sort of akin to endowing a festival or a meal for some occasion, an anniversary, or providing for the baths, and these kinds of things. It's sort of similar to that, but inflected with more piety. Um, Now, you talk also quite a bit, and this I found very useful and illuminating, the just the sheer economics
Mhm.
of animal sacrifice, both either on an individual, like an individual sacrifice level, or on a sort of urban or empire-wide level. I was just wondering if you could just tell us, just give us a little bit of insight into the economic dimension here, the sort of either disparities of wealth, the costs associated, or the relative value of animals. Like, what's the status hierarchy of sacrificing? I mean, like from an ox you mentioned earlier down to, I mean, I guess most people would have to get by with non-animal sacrifices like grain or wine, right? Like, so,
Right.
like, is there a pretty well understood hierarchy of cost?
I think so. Again, I think it would have been a hierarchy of cost that most people in the ancient world would have recognized um, sort of automatically without, it wouldn't require any explication. Um, Yeah, all animals cost money. Some cost more than others. So at the lower end of the spectrum, you would have things like lambs or even more piglets. Um, Often the young of these animals would be culled anyway to make for to make herds more productive. It's just part of animal husbandry. So even people of relatively low status might have had, on an annual basis, or maybe even a bit more, the ability to slaughter a lamb or a
Hmm.
pig. Um, Full-grown animals obviously require more, um, upkeep. They're a bigger investment to raise them to adulthood. They require more in terms of feed, et cetera, and care, et cetera. Um, uh, and some species of animals require more expense than others. Cattle, for example, require a lot of high quality food, preferably grass, but there are other options. They can't be raised in just any location, certainly not in any quantity.
Mm-hmm.
So to sacrifice um, a, a full-grown bovine is a pretty big statement of wealth. And there's more gradations I could go into, but
Right.
that's the purpose. So I think for most people, most of the time, they would, as you say, have contented themselves and contented the gods with offerings of grain, flowers, a bit of incense, libations, and that would have been a perfectly sufficient
Mm.
expression of piety towards the gods.
Okay. Um, so most of your book is on, you know, the classical Roman Empire, pre-late antiquity. Um, and so let's now my interest, probably the interest of most of the audience, lie in the later part where things actually get weirdly interesting. Let's start in the third century. A number of historians have postulated in the past that animal sacrifice declined, let's say at least in sort of popularity, that is or incidence during the third century. So what's this idea based on? And if true, why might it have declined?
That's a very good question. Unfortunately, it's not based on very much. This is a problem well, it was a problem for me, and it's for a problem for a lot of people interested in this sort of historical trajectory of animal sacrifice. Um, those who see a decline in the third century, and I would include myself among them, I think to a large part are projecting back into the third century the situation we find in the fourth century, when surprisingly quickly animal sacrifice, which was so well established and so long established and so widely established, fairly quickly collapses. It fairly quickly seems to fade away, or to be more precise, to be suppressed. Uh,
Hmm.
And it's a little hard to believe that it could have been so effectively and so quickly suppressed had it not been weakening already.
Right.
I think that's the premise most people operate with. Um, the problem is there's not a very good way to support this assumption, or to um, to support it on an evidentiary basis. Um, the most rigorous study I've seen yet that tries to examine actual evidence from the third century and see if there's any indication of a decline is Yash Elsner's paper, in which he looks at all the visual evidence for sacrificial practice in the third century and can document a decline in representations of animal sacrifice and a correlated increase of representations of non-animal sacrifice, beginning in the first part of that century, but accelerating after about the year 230. And that's the only study I've seen that actually is grounded in a survey
Mm.
of evidence. You can imagine doing something similar for inscriptional evidence um, that might show similar pattern. The problem there is that there's already a well-documented decline in inscriptional evidence in general across the board, moving from the early to the mid third century. So it's not clear how probative such a survey would be. Um, why, as I say, many people do think there's a decline. I would argue that if there is, it's because animal sacrifice first is under economic pressures. There's a big debate these days whether it's appropriate to call what's going on in the Roman Empire in the third century a crisis. this was the term that we
Mm.
all learned as undergraduates, the crisis of the third century. That's been challenged, and I think for good reasons. But even if you reject the notion of a crisis, there's still fairly dramatic changes going on in that period. And some of those changes do involve economic pressures. Um, and that would be one reason why animal sacrifice might decline. It's also clear that the cities of the Roman Empire are changing in some ways. Local elites seem to be, again, the evidence is uncertain, but seem to be retreating from their position as sort of public benefactors and are not as willing to invest so much of their resources in that position. And that would also affect their willingness to fund and preside over animal sacrifices. So that's where I would see the real ground for a possible decline in the third century, but it's very difficult to document.
It is. And when I was a student and read about this decline, I always felt sort of vaguely nervous about the way it was presented because in the context of some arguments, it seemed to take the form that, well, uh, so Greco-Roman paganism was kind of dying on its own. It was hollowed out. People didn't believe this stuff anymore. And this thereby became a an argument that was a kind of proxy argument for why Christianity triumphed.
Right,
It was always this sort of thing that, well, they weren't too interested in their old religions by that point.
right.
And this was supposed to explain why they sort of reached for Christianity, which brought in some new, blood. No, no pun intended. But
So to speak.
and that all just made me feel a little, I don't know, this is very teleological, and I know what they're doing. Um, and then there were other historians of ancient religion would say that sacrifice is like the core, the heart of ancient paganism by whatever name. And I don't know, I was never sure that it was. Maybe I'd been reading too much Porphyry, I guess. But anyway, so yeah, those arguments, even if they are correct about the decline of sacrifice, can be presented in ways that are kind of problematic.
Yeah. Let me just add there, when I talk about the decline, I would specifically say the decline of animal
Right.
sacrifice.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
again key to my argument that animal sacrifice per se is not necessary. Offerings to the gods are necessary.
Right. Right.
They don't
Mhm.
have to involve the slaughter of an
Yeah.
animal. And so, if there's a decline in animal sacrifice, I would see it as being accompanied, and this is what Yaj Elsner sorts of documents, by an increase in non-animal sacrifices, more
Right. Right.
incense, more lamps, more not, garlands, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So I would not, I totally agree with you, want to endorse the argument that paganism was in decline.
Right. Yeah. And I'm also intrigued by economic explanations. I mean, you mentioned some of them. We know that there are significant economic pressures on cities, on endowments for temples and games and spectacles, and this might have just simply, yeah. I mean, we've all lived through austerity in various ways. We know what gets cut.
Right.
Um, but I was also interested in an argument, a particular theory that you make in the book, that as these local bigwigs, who are the kind of people who would sponsor and pay for sacrifices locally, as they turn to careers in the imperial government, um, this not only diverted like their resources away from those kinds of local expenses, um, but the whole sociological point of the spectacle of ancient sacrifice in the city, which was to demonstrate, right, and to reaffirm their social position, was kind of like no longer necessary because they were now turning their ambitions elsewhere. And I think that's spot on. I mean, I would have some things to add about that, but I was just kind of wondering if you could say a few more words about that.
Yeah. Um, to backtrack a bit, I made the argument that animal sacrifice was useful in terms of structuring socioeconomic hierarchies, especially within cities. It allowed I see it as a key element in what scholars conventionally call euergetism, from the Greek word euergetes, benefactor. And in this system, and this is not my idea, it's long established, um, local elite expended their own resources on public benefactions in return for public recognition of their superior status and their control over public affairs. And it justified and motivated them to retain these positions. They used their income to keep local cities going, to put it in rather crude terms.
Hmm.
And this was crucial to the empire as a whole, in my view, because as many people have pointed out, the Romans were able to maintain a very extensive empire with a remarkably small governing apparatus. And they were able to do that because they relied on local elites to take on most of the work of local administration. And the motivation for them to do so was this euergetic system, that they were recognized as the bigwigs in their own towns, their own communities. And so there was a real alignment between the practice of public animal sacrifice and the way the empire as a whole was structured. As that structure changed along the lines you say, that alignment was thrown out of whack. If local elites were no longer so invested in establishing their positions locally, if they were looking more towards large-scale imperial structures, the imperial bureaucracy, the army, the imperial authorized church, if they were looking to these large, centralized, empire-wide institutions for their self-promotion, they were less invested in their local communities, and there was less reason for them to participate in this tradition of public animal sacrifice. It was no longer, I see it, as I say, out of alignment with the structures of the empire that are coming into being and becoming dominant.
I think that is, I underlined furiously there. I was in sort of very strong agreement with that approach because I think it's a blind spot that in the study of late antiquity, I think that the normative, so the way of life of the Roman cities in like the second century is taken as normative, and any change from that is a decline. And so when you start to see local elites doing other kinds of things, and in particular, not continuing this old endowment system of I'm going to build a theater, I'm going to perform a sac, I'm going to do whatever, but they're off to Constantinople to join the
Right.
Senate, this is taken as a decline. And even in Jones, right, like the standard
Mhm.
administrative history of the later Roman Empire, the focus is relentlessly on the decline of the city councils and like what they're doing and what. But and this is something that I tried to highlight in my history, just looking at the flip side of that. The flip side of that is the creation of a much larger centralized imperial administration, which is drawing these people from all the provinces. In other words, it's filling in the gaps between the center and the provinces with all of these, functionaries, officials, and so forth. And it's just creating a more centralized state. And that more centralized state is doing other kinds of things. It's not always about endowing bathhouses in local cities, but having this much more massive army and taxing the provinces more efficiently and I think more fairly. And that needs officials and also law. Now everyone's a Roman citizen, so Roman law has to start solving all these other kinds of problems. And that just requires a bigger government and more taxes and so forth. And in other words, you're just seeing the creation of a different kind of state with different priorities. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a yeah, you lose some things here and you gain other things there.
Mhm.
And we can point to a lot of the other things that we gain. For example, we gain like the whole imperial church That's a massive infrastructural undertaking, right?
Huge.
With land endowments and rules and laws and canons and church canons and councils and bishops and priests, like, that's huge.
Right.
So yeah, that's got to come out of somewhere.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So I just see the flip side of that, that something is being created. It's not that something is being destroyed. But yeah, I mean, maybe they lost animal sacrifice as kind of a, uh, um, so let's look at some other aspects of this transition. So before the mid-third century, is it ever a requirement of Greek or Roman religion that one participate, perform, or attend an animal sacrifice?
No, absolutely not. And for two reasons. One, as we already have discussed, um, animal sacrifice was a pricey proposition, and a lot of people would probably encounter it a few times a year because they didn't have the resources and their friends didn't have the resources to do it very often. They would have encountered it in public context or on a big celebration on a more personal context, like for maybe a wedding or something like that. Um, so it was certainly not a crucial element in that respect in Greco-Roman religious tradition. The second reason is that it was not the business, or it never had been the business of Roman authorities to enforce anybody's participation in any kind of particular ritual. Cities would have the rituals, public festivals in honor of a particular set of gods that they had sort of pledged to perform in order to keep the gods happy. But these were carried out by public officials, and public participation was not, in a sense, required. Most people probably would have participated just because it was a big celebration and everybody wants a holiday.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't have been, there was no mechanism for ensuring that people participated. If you consistently failed to take part in a public celebration or consistently refused invitations to attend someone else's sacrifice, you would probably attract unfavorable notice from your neighbors.
Right.
But I would say that's as far as it went.
Yeah. Yeah. And this changes dramatically after the mid-third century, at least from the standpoint of the authorities. So something curious happens with the emperor. So we call in English what is Decius, right?
Yeah,
In Greek, it's Vekios. And you wrote this brilliant article about what he did back in '99, and I might link to that separately in the episode description. But I think you go over the basics in the book
yeah.
in order to explain what's going on with sacrifice. So, what was he trying to do, and what did it do instead?
Well, what he did, I think most people would agree now, was to issue a decree that all free inhabitants of the Roman Empire take part in an animal sacrifice and receive official certification that they had done so. So, for the first time, as far as I can tell, ever, there was a mechanism for ensuring that people did participate on an individual basis in a particular sort of cult act. And that is, as far as I can tell, effectively unprecedented.
Hmm.
Why he did that is very unclear. Um, our evidence for the reign of Decius is meager in the extreme. In terms of literary sources, we have only we have later epitomes that devote maybe 5 sentences to his reign. They don't mention the edict at all. We have some contemporary sources from Christian bishops, but they are, of course, focused on the effects of the decree on their communities, and they don't have any insight or offer any insight into what he was trying to do. People have argued various things. My own guess, and it's little more than an informed guess, is that if there were a decline in the practice of public animal sacrifice, he may have noticed this. He may have associated it with the increasing pressures that the empire was under. And he may have thought that this decline in what had been such a standard procedure may have been connected with those increasing pressures. And by enforcing it, by requiring everyone to take part in it, he might be able to do something to reverse those increasing challenges.
Right.
That's just a guess. As I say, our evidence, we don't have any evidence to speak of other than the, the certificates, and they don't express any views as to why he wanted to do this.
Right. I mean, his goal was some kind of universal performance of traditional Roman piety, presumably everyone to do so according to the particular sacrificial rituals that prevailed in their cities or wherever, with the, I think we now take it to be inadvertent result that people who had an objection to performing animal sacrifices to the gods suddenly found themselves left out, exposed
It's
to official, right?
right.
And that this some is essentially morphed into a anti-Christian, I guess persecution would be the word. This was not the intent.
Yeah, yeah. That's certainly how Christians or Christian leaders, our two main sources are Cyprian of Carthage, Bishop Cyprian of Carthage and Dionysius of Alexandria. That's certainly how they perceived it. And that was one of the effects. Again, I think largely unintended. As you say, it exposed Christians in a way that they had never been exposed before. Another thing it threw up, though, in connection with Christians, is that our sources make it fairly clear that a lot of people who identified as Christians and participated in Christian communities did comply with the decree. And many of them, at least, seem to have been taken by surprise that they were then vilified and ostracized by their communities and by their Christian leaders,
Mm.
which suggests that there were substantial numbers of people, of Christians, who did not see participation in an animal sacrifice per se as that big a deal. So another effect it had on Christians was that it provided, or it sort of incentivized Christian leaders to double down on their status, their position that animal sacrifice was absolutely incompatible with Christian adherence. If you participated in it, you were kicked out of the Christian community, if not forever, at least until your final days after extensive penance. It was one of the worst sins possible. And so they really doubled down on that position of animal sacrifice being inherently and categorically incompatible with Christian adherence.
There seems to be a double downing that is on the part of both sides here. In
Yeah,
other words, the Roman authorities now start doubling down on animal sacrifice as precisely the kind of litmus test that will reveal who is being pious and who might be undermining the empire's relationship with the gods by not
right,
performing this, right? In other words, suddenly the Roman state starts treating sacrifice as a kind of requirement, which it
right,
had never been before.
right,
And on the Christian side, they start treating it as this like red line that if you cross, you cannot be a member of a Christian community. And we're not talking about Christians who like on their own perform sacrifices at home or anything like that, but they just merely participated in something that the state was organizing
right,
to get a certificate.
right, exactly.
So the positions seem to have hardened here, with this paradoxical result that, like, into the fourth century, if we extend it as far as Julian, who took this same right approach, that animal sacrifice is somehow the sign, the key act that defines traditional pagan religiosity,
Yeah,
right? I mean, it's strange that,
yeah, I would say that's a development. What in effect Decius did with his decree was, I think, make sacrifice, animal sacrifice, a marker of being a Roman.
right? Yep.
I see,
Okay.
and it's a really interesting parallel that the apparatus that was used to certify the offering of participating in an animal sacrifice was very similar to that was in place for collecting taxes. So just as people owed taxes as members of the Roman Empire, now they owed an animal sacrifice as members of the Roman Empire. So it became a marker for Decius and emperors who followed him, notably Diocletian and his colleagues in the Tetrarchy in the early 4th century. It became a marker of Roman imperial identity. And as you say, both sides hardened. Emperors were insisting on it as a marker of Roman identity. Christian leaders were insisting on opposing it as a marker of non-Christian identity. And so Roman and Christian identities as a result became incompatible. What's interesting about Constantine, to get to the 4th century and to get to the Christian Empire, there's been a long-standing debate. Did Constantine issue a formal ban of animal sacrifice? People have argued this way and that. The evidence is flat out contradictory, as well as not being very robust. For my money, that's a bit of a red herring. What Constantine did, and I think very cleverly, and whatever else you can say about Constantine, he was a pretty clever guy.
Yes, agreed.
Whether or not he formally banned it, I think he probably did not. He did publicly distance it from Roman identity. If you have the emperor publicly saying that this practice is disgusting, is revolting, and issuing directives not maybe forbidding it, but refusing to forbidding Roman officials engage in it in their capacity as Roman officials, he's separating that connection that we had earlier seen under Decius Diocletian between animal sacrifice and the Roman Empire and Roman identity. And what he's doing again instead is sort of associating it with a particular religious adherence, an adherence to whatever was not Christianity, and some Christians already in his day were starting to call pagan identity. And that's what you get dominating in the 4th century, that the result, I think, of Constantine's actions, where animal sacrifice becomes a marker of pagan identity and rejection of it becomes a marker of Christian identity. And this is true even for Julian, who was an enthusiastic supporter of animal sacrifice. And evidently, according to historian Ammianus, who was actually a fan of Julian, he slaughtered so many animals that it looked like superstition rather than piety. But even Julian saw animal sacrifice as a marker of a pagan identity. The only difference is that it's an identity he wanted to promote rather than marginalize and suppress.
That is very interesting. What you say, you discuss it in the book. You said it now, that these emperors who are associated with the persecutions, also Decius, I suppose, Valerian, Diocletian, Galerius, they very emphatically talk about something called Roman religion. They use religio or religiones, which is equal. Like, okay, I think they're generally acknowledging that different cults and rituals and traditions exist throughout the empire. They're all practiced by Roman citizens now, so I guess they're all Roman. And Christianity, on the other hand, or Manichaeism or whatever they're targeting at that time. I find it interesting that they're constructing this idea of Roman religion and tying it to sacrifice at precisely this time. And Constantine is trying to uncouple those things, and redefine them along the lines that you mentioned. I think this is a very interesting story. I think more can be written about this. And I find it interesting in particular. I mean, this is something that recurs even throughout like later East Roman history, where something that So they're practices, religious practices that are subsequently seen as traditional when in fact they've just recently been invented out, precisely as the outcome of a controversy. And the veneration of icons is one of those
Mm.
things. People did whatever they did with icons without anyone paying much attention to this or theorizing it very much until you have iconoclasm. And it's in the aftermath of iconoclasm when the icons win that suddenly this becomes a like, no, this was always a central part of Orthodox identity.
Right.
And it's something similar to that with this sacrifice. And like, no, animal sacrifice had never been this like core part of Roman identity until you have a conflict about it. And then suddenly it becomes that. And then the Christians treat it that way. And
Yeah.
anyway,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So there's one other thing that I picked out in reading the book, and it's something that you tantalize your readers at the very, very beginning, and then you come back to it at the end. And just to be clear to the audience, this is not like a thesis of the book. This is not what you're trying to do, and this is about whether, in a certain sense, the outcome of all of this process points to some kind of let's say, quantum leap in the way that, say, religion is defined, right? Like there might be something categorically different about the way people understood religion before all of these developments that we've been talking about and after. Okay, so just to set a little bit of the context, I I have been told by so many colleagues that, oh, like for example, there's no such thing as religion in the ancient world because religion, as we understand it, was invented by, and here you just fill in the blank. I mean, it's the rise of Islam, sometimes it's the Reformation, sometimes it's the Enlightenment, sometimes it's some obscure Swiss theorist of religion in the 18 whatever. Like you pick your definition. So, in other words, religion is defined narrowly to be this. And so, before that, they didn't have a concept of religion, quote, as we understand it. Oh, by the way, yes, I'm sorry, I remembered now. So, if you don't mind, I'd like to read you a few sentences from Arthur Schopenhauer, who was a German philosopher of the early 19th century. And he had an essay on religion, which is a philosophical essay, and, in the typical kind of enlightenment skeptical mode. But this is a dialogue. One of his and I remember this. I read this as an undergrad. One of his characters. This is the one called Philalithes, which means the lover of truth. So you know who he's speaking for. And he says he has this page, and he says that the ancients and especially the Greeks possessed nothing whatever of what we understand as religion. They had no sacred scriptures. They had no dogmas which were taught, adherence to which was expected of everyone. And nor did the administrators of their religion preach morals. The duties of priests extended no further than temple ceremonial and prayers and hymns. Uh, and he goes on and on. No trace of a duty to believe in any dogma. Immortality of the soul, control over society by priests. And he says, the ancients really had no religion in our sense of the word. I don't know if this was an old position by his time or this is something that Schopenhauer came up with, but it made a very striking impression on me when I read it. So, maybe we can discuss the general issues at stake here, but what is your argument? And or not an argument, it's more of a I think it's more like a I don't know, thought experiment or something. Like if we define religion like this, then the fourth century is a kind of turning point. What happened then, and what emerges at the end of that process that you think might be a turning point?
That's a great question. And I did not know that bit from Schopenhauer, but I think he's absolutely right. I agree with him. Um, and for people who work on Greek and Roman religion, this is becoming, well, it's been a controversy. But my take on it, on the use of religion, the use of the term religion in talking about Greco-Roman culture, really comes out of teaching undergraduate classes. Because when you talk about religion, I think people do bring to that word brings up certain connotations.
Hmm.
many of the ones that Schopenhauer mentioned, I would say others would include a sort of distinct part of your identity that you can give a particular label to. If you think about the census forms, there are
Mhm.
boxes to tick. Are you Christian? If so, are you Catholic or Protestant? Are you Jewish? Are you Hindu? Are you Muslim? These are
Mhm.
labels for what we would call specifically religious identity. And you can have one of those identities. You can be a Jew, but be an American or a Briton or whatever. Um, uh, we also tend, the word religion also tends to raise the idea of specific institutions and structures that are have a distinct place within society, that are totally or primarily aimed at relationships with the divine. So churches or mosques or temples or that sort of thing.
Mhm.
And a lot of these connotations that come to people's mind don't really apply to the Greek and Roman world. The structures there were very different. The way the people's interaction with the divine world was not mediated primarily through specific institutions that were devoted to that part of life. They were the same institutions that structured people's lives in other respects: the family, community organizations, the city. People didn't have labels that they could adopt. They couldn't say, um, there was no word to say, I'm a Roman religionist. Those labels, by and large, simply didn't exist. You could say someone participated in a particular cultural or ethnic tradition as a way of honoring the gods, but
Mhm.
those were broader terms. In my book, it strikes me that in the fourth century, more of those connotations are more applicable. There were labels that you could adopt. You could be a Christian or a Jew. These were terms that people used of themselves and of other people. There were terms that could be used hostilely of other people, like pagan, but a corresponding term that people could use as a self-identification. Julian preferred the term Hellene to mean not only a cultural identity, but also a specific religious identity.
Mhm.
There were, as we were saying earlier, now institutions that were whose primary purpose was to structure relationships with the divine world. The Christian church is the foremost example of that. There were sacred scriptures, again, the Christian scriptures, um, but also increasingly in pagan and non-Christian philosophy, the works of Plato are increasingly treated almost as scripture to be exegeted and
Mhm.
interpreted. So um, I see that I wouldn't claim that religion per se came into being in the fourth century. I would simply say that there are more connotations that the word religion carries for a modern audience in evidence in the fourth century than there were prior to that time.
Mhm.
And animal sacrifice gets caught up in those changes, as we've said, because it becomes a marker for a specific religious identity, one to which you can attach a specific label.
Yes, I appreciated the nuance with which you handled this question because I've seen it handled in a much more sort of blunt way, like broadsword. And I, I think that the utility of understanding religion, either in a very, very broad sense that will include everybody, right? Like you can say, well, if you have gods and
Yeah,
myths and some form of ritual by which you honor or communicate with them, that we'll call that religion. And if you went to ancient Rome or ancient Athens and you asked them, say, what are the sorts of things that you do for the gods? They will say, well, we've got the temples over there, and we've got the sacrifices here, and Craig over there is the priest this year, and whatever. Like they know what you meant.
yeah, yeah.
And so I can't, like, on a certain level of analysis, I can't bring myself to accept that conclusion. However, using more precise not more precise, sorry, but more specific definitions is is good for pedagogy, for one thing, for understanding changes that happen in history, right? They do happen. They're different kinds of religions, right? And and for creating a more fine-grained history of how these changes happen. Yes. And I think you're proposing a moment where something seems to be changing here in how people you self-identify and the coordinates that they use in order to do so. And that's fine. But anyway, it all depends on how it's done and why.
Yeah,
For
yeah.
me, yeah,
Yeah, I would say, going back to your earlier point, that I do think the fourth century is in some ways a turning point. I
absolutely.
would say the same about the rise of Islam. I would say the same about the Protestant Reformation, the same
Yeah,
about the Enlightenment.
yeah,
All of these are steps getting from then to now, you might say.
right.
Um,
Yeah,
and to point at any one period and say,
yes,
religion didn't exist before and now it does,
yes.
is to simplify a very complex and long, gradual development.
Yeah, I've seen the same claim made about just about every term that we use to talk
Yeah,
about history, everything from art to
right,
right the nation to whatever.
right.
You
The
know,
trouble is, all these terms are too big and too capacious and
yeah,
too
yeah,
fond.
yeah. I think it depends on the kinds of questions you're asking and what you want
Sure.
to do. Yeah, yeah. Anyway,
Yeah,
James, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast.
my pleasure.
It was a pleasure for me to finally speak with you. I mean, not in person as I would have liked, but I've been reading you for well decades.
Oh,
So thank you for everything,
well, thank you.
and
I appreciate it.
yeah, I look forward to your next project.
Yeah, well, me too. We'll see if it happens.
Yes. Take care.
You too.